Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about society in the antebellum South. Antebellum meaning the period before the war, coming from Latin, ante meaning before, and bellum meaning war. So we'll be talking about the southern states of the United States from 1800 to 1860. Here are your goals. There are a lot of them, but there's a lot of important information that's going to happen in this video. So one thing that's interesting is that when the United States came into being under the Constitution, slavery was actually on the decline. Most leading Southerners viewed slavery as an evil, and they believed and hoped that it would gradually fade away and be replaced by free labor. Thomas Jefferson once famously said that, "You know that nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition, not only of the trade, but of the condition of slavery. And certainly nobody will be more willing to encounter every sacrifice for that object." So here we have a leading Southern intellectual, both stating that he wishes for the end of slavery and hoping that it will happen. Many Southerners viewed slavery as cruel, backwards, and less efficient than the system of free labor that was used in the North. But this all changes in 1793, and the main cause is that this guy, Eli Whitney, invents the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is a simple machine for removing seeds from raw cotton. And what this machine does is that overnight it makes growing cotton on plantations via slave labor extremely profitable. Before this, you couldn't really grow cotton in most of the South because it was really hard to get all the seeds out, but now with the cotton gin, it becomes possible to make a huge fortune growing cotton. And so slavery, which had been on the decline, now begins to grow rapidly. And from 1800 to 1860, the number of slaves in the South increases by 4 times, from 1 million to 4 million people. So cotton was kind of the backbone of the Southern economy from 1800 to 1860. And it is a huge industry. It was big business. In 1840, the South produced 50% of all of the world's cotton, and 50% of everything that the United States exported was cotton. Most of this going to cotton mills in Europe, especially in Britain, where they would turn them into clothes and sell them to the rest of the world. And so cotton was something that you could produce pretty easily on a large plantation. It was very labor intensive, but the labor wasn't necessarily very difficult, so it was pretty easy to get slave labor to be productive to this end. And so what happens is people who are wealthy in the South begin to invest most of their money in slaves and in rich land for growing cotton. And so we see a huge transfer of wealth from all sorts of different things in the South to slaves and plantations. Basically, everybody invests in this. And a few people become incredibly wealthy. Plantation owners become very, very rich. But the downsides of this are super important and pretty obvious. One, slavery leads to terrible suffering for millions of African Americans. It also prevents them from becoming literate or practicing political stuff. So it's really bad for this huge group of people who live in the South. It also is bad for cities and industry because cities and industry require lots of investment, but in the South, all the money is going into slavery and land, so there's no investment, there's no money going into cities and industry. There's also no immigration because immigrants can't compete with slave labor. And finally, there's growing inequality between rich and poor whites. What happens is the rich whites buy all the good land for their plantations, and this leaves poor white people with bad land that's not very productive, and they are forced to live there. And so they are poor farmers forced to eke out an existence on bad farmland. To elaborate on the disadvantages of the slave society in the South, we need to look at the gross inequality that occurs in Southern society because of slavery. basically you can break down Southern society before the war into 4 classes. There's the plantation owners, people who own more than 20 slaves, and these guys are the elite class of the antebellum South. Below them are small slave owners. These guys own between 1 and 20 slaves, and they work on small farms, and these guys even usually just work right beside the enslaved people that they have purchased. And below these guys, you've got non-slave owning whites, and this is the largest group in Southern society. It's almost 5 million people. These guys are poor farmers, and they live in the backcountry away from rich cotton lands. And then the second largest group in the South, and the group that has it probably the worst off, are the 3 to 3.5 million slaves who basically had no political rights, no education, and very little chance for any kind of improvement. So let's look a little bit more at the plantation-owning elites. So cotton production in the South generated immense profits, but almost all of these profits went straight to the small group of plantation owners, these 600,000 wealthiest Southerners. And this allowed them to live an aristocratic lifestyle. Most of these people had their children educated in northern or foreign private schools because the South didn't really have any good schools. They were able to import fine European luxuries like wine and furniture and silk clothes, and they lived in huge, luxurious manor houses. And they were able to devote most of their time to government and politics and other sort of leisure type or leadership type activities. So a lot of the United States leading politicians came from the South. Think Thomas Jefferson, think John C. Calhoun. These guys were slave owners who came from the South and were able to finance their political activity by owning lots of slaves. And these guys held to the ideal of the quote-unquote country gentleman. And so these rich Southerners who owned 20 or more slaves claimed that they were actually more civilized than their rich northern peers. And the reason they claimed this is they said that they didn't have to labor, they didn't have to work, so they could devote themselves to higher matters like art and politics and leadership and stuff like that. And so they claimed that while the people in the North had to labor in order to remain rich, they had to devote their time to working, the rich Southerners could basically devote their time to whatever they wanted, and therefore they were more civilized. And so you might think this is a kind of hypocritical thing to claim when your quote-unquote civilization rests on the back of slave labor, but they actually argued that slavery was a natural feature of well-developed civilizations, and they pointed at ancient Rome and ancient Greece, both of which were slave-based societies, and argued that this was proof that slavery was a natural part of a civilization. Of course, this ignored important differences between Roman and American forms of slavery. American slavery was way, way worse for the people who happened to be enslaved. Let's look at the poor white people of the South. These guys can be divided into 2 groups. They're the small-time slave owners and then the non-slave owning whites. So the small-time slave owners represented the middle class of Southern society, and they were usually small farmers. They were able to make some money off of raising cotton, which they could then sell to buy other stuff they needed, but they also had to work hard just to feed themselves. And many of these guys labored right next to their slaves. So the slaves were less servants and more like permanently purchased farm hands that they would work with. And then last of all, you've got the non-slave owning whites. So these guys were the biggest group. They were the majority of Southern whites, and they were unable to afford good land because all the good land had been purchased by slave owners. And this meant that they had to more or less eke out an existence on bad land, and they worked basically just to feed themselves, growing mostly corn and also raising pigs. And terrible poverty was pretty much the norm for these guys, and many suffered from malnutrition and all sorts of diseases. Alright, so let's take a minute just to think about how white Southerners felt about slavery. So, as we said before, a lot of leading white people in the South considered slavery to be evil, and even in the early 1800s, they didn't really like to talk about it. So instead of referring to slavery, they would always use the euphemism, "our peculiar institution." But by 1850, this had changed. Rich white people in the South supported slavery because it was the basis of their wealth and their status. And an end to slavery would mean that an end to their special gentlemanly lifestyle where they basically never have to work. And they also argued that slavery in the South was actually better than being a wage slave working in a factory up north. Poor whites also supported slavery, though, and this is pretty weird because, as we know, slavery actually hurt poor white people because it excluded them from the labor pool and forced them off of good farmland. But they continued to support it for two reasons. One, lots of poor white people dream one day of saving up enough money to buy slaves themselves and thus becoming plantation owners, even though this dream is more or less impossible. And they also support slavery because this meant that poor whites, even though they were poor and sometimes living in more impoverished conditions than some slaves, could take pride in the fact that they were white and free rather than black and enslaved. So this sort of racist attitude supports slavery even among people who don't benefit from the system. And so what is weird about the South is that even though most Southerners don't actually benefit from slavery, they're hurt by slavery, they still support it. And this is why the South is willing to go to war over slavery when the Civil War breaks out. Your goals again. Thanks for bearing with me.